go. So I think everybody knows I'm Jack and this is Warren. He's only 100, but he will be 101 soon. So what's going to happen? Well, first of all, we're going to have a series of talks, and you can get the information as you leave. Next week, I'll be here again with another book and another guy talking about his mother. A whole different story. She died over at Springfield Hospital with a rare disease, which we figured out. But we're just going to talk about Warren's mom today and Warren. So Warren's going to do 95% of the talking, and he's going to do 100% of the singing. I'm just going to get him started with a couple questions. And we're going to go sequentially today. We jump around a lot, but today we're going to go sort of sequentially. So Warren, let's start with Carrie's mom.
My mother was named Carrie, a wonderful woman. She was the daughter of an ex-slave.
This is Carrie.
She was known in the community where she lived when she came out of slave as Aunt Kitty. Her name was Catherine. She was the answer to how African Americans were treated in those days, for medicine, for a lot of things. She was the closest thing to somebody who could provide some kind of soothing if a person got sick. Everybody called Aunt Kitty. If somebody got sick, go call Aunt Kitty. If somebody died, because they used to, those days, the family laid out their own bodies in the homes, go get Aunt Kitty. If a woman was ready to have a baby, go get Aunt Kitty. In fact, Aunt Kitty delivered me. And out of the 12 kids in my family, Aunt Kitty delivered 10 of us. Mostly because the services of a trained medical person weren't available to people of my background.
Could you tell us about Aunt Kitty as a child?
Aunt Kitty as a child lived in slavery in a compound that is now the area known as Marriottsville. My daddy said in the days when she was in slavery, that area was called Little Africa. It was all the area was owned by a guy named Anderson. My belief, and I have reason to think so, that he was the father of my grandmother that everybody called Aunt Kitty. She was very fair-skinned. Somebody's asking, did she ever try to pass as white? I said, anytime it suited her fancy or anytime it was necessary, yes.
So, as a child, as a slave, she would have looked like a little white girl.
Yes. And she had seen 3 of her siblings sold at auction and moved south. Anderson never sold my grandmother, Aunt Kitty, and my belief is he didn't sell it because that was his daughter. And further indications that probably was the case. When slavery was ended and the slaves were freed, he was in advanced years, and not too long after Aunt Kitty had moved away and married a man who really was working for her release from the slave owner to take as a wife, which was not uncommon in those days. He called for Aunt Kitty.
Isaac Anderson called for Aunt Kitty.
Isaac Anderson, who was the slave owner, called for Aunt Kitty, and she went. And I think that it was further recognition that that was his daughter, and she recognized that was her father. So she went to comfort him in his dying years.
And had they had any contact over the years before that, or they were estranged from each other?
I think primarily that's the case. He was in advanced years, and he didn't have much contact with anybody. And most of the slaves had no reason to be enamored to him, because they were always on the verge of moving somewhere as a result of a sale.
Did you mention that his business was slave dealing?
His business, he didn't do any farming or didn't raise a product. His business was buying and selling slaves. He would meet the boats as they came in Annapolis and buy slaves off the ships, and would house them in his compound in what is now known as Marysville until he could ship them south or wherever somebody wanted to take advantage of his of the service that he offered. And his offer was to supply the manpower for a price to anybody who was in the market and would go to the auctions to buy some new hands to work his land.
So how did Kitty finally get free?
And Kitty was freed when the slaves were freed, but during the latter lot of years of her in slavery, she was being bought by a guy named John Dorsey. In those days, a freed African could buy a bride from a slave owner, and he was in the process of working it out with Isaac Anderson so he could have her free to marry. But slavery ended before that occurred. But she joined him after slavery was declared ended, and they built a house in what is now Bushy Park. In the early days, it was known as Bush Park, and the reason probably was that the land that was set aside by planters who owned it and slave owners who owned parts of it, they set aside this tract of land so that these ex-slaves and other freed African Americans could establish dwellings. And my grandmother, Aunt Kitty, and her and the gentleman who finally ended up with her as his wife, John Dorsey, they were a part of this community, and they raised 12 kids there. Also, my mother was one of the 12, and she was the 9th kid. She had 12 kids, and I'm the 9th kid.
So, Aunt Kitty's 9th kid was Carrie. Now, Carrie married Ed. Let's hear Ed's background.
Ed's background is different. He is the grandchild of Mary. I think her name probably, her maiden name probably was Clendenin. What?
McLennan.
McLennan, yes. And he was a mulatto. He paraded around as a white man, or not necessarily, but he didn't identify as an African American. He worked for a farmer in Montgomery County, and a young lady named Mary, probably her last name was Clendenin, McClendon. He forgot what I was going to say.
He married her.
Yeah, he married her. His name was Mad Savoy. And several people asked my daddy, well, how do you spell Mad? My father said, I don't honestly know, but I think it was M-A-D-D. And that was his name. And he was the father of Aunt Kitty.
Not Aunt Kitty.
He was the father of
Ed's mom.
Ed's mom. Ed's mom was Georgiana.
Georgiana.
And she married a guy named Mad Savoy. And my lineage has evolved from there.
And just like Aunt Kitty, Georgiana could pass as a white woman, correct?
Yes, she indeed could. And she did when it suited her fancy. But she died as a very young lady. She was only 37 when she passed away.
So tell about the 5 kids and what happened to them when she died.
When she died, there were 7 kids who survived. 2 older ones were girls, and they got married. It was not unusual for girls to marry as teenagers. And they'd moved away. One name was Emma. She moved in the Washington, lived in Fairmount Heights, which is just outside of the D.C. And the other moved in a place not too far from here, off of Gate Road, in some very unproductive land, trying to farm it.
So, there were 5 kids, right?
There were 5 kids. The
older sisters took one. Nobody took your dad.
The older one, Emma, took Hattie, who was the youngest. She was a girl, and was raised in mostly in the D.C. And the younger, the next oldest child was Rose, who had married Gus Rubottom, who they lived on some rather unproductive land not too far from here, off of Roebuck Road. And she took the youngest boy named Ben, that left Ed, and nobody took Ed.
How old was Ed?
He was about 14 years old. And he raised himself. Ed was my father. And he sort of raised himself. He migrated to the Baltimore area, which was not unusual. People who grew up in Bushy Park couldn't find any employment, and they would venture out to joining communities. Mostly, a lot of them ended up in Baltimore. That's where Ed spent most of his life. But he traveled a bit. Even he said he'd travel west past Frederick, where I presently live. But he raised himself. He picked up a lot of skills along the way. Now, Ed, my daddy, had a brilliant mind by anybody's measurement. He never had the opportunity to go to a formal school. He was self-educated, but he was a smart dude. And during his rearing himself, mostly in Baltimore, he picked up skills. One, he was a pool shark. Some of you know what that means. And I surmised, and with reason, that he picked up the skill by hanging out in pool halls, sometimes for a place for a night's sleep or something. And he got to be very proficient at it. And I think that he used to help support himself by taking on all comers playing pool. Well, my daddy had a brilliant mind. He could do anything that he put his mind to doing.
So, how did Ed and Carrie end up together?
They knew each other in their very early life. But my daddy, who raised himself and often was out gallivanting around the world, he had the idea that I've heard him say that he thought that every little pretty girl was his. And Carrie was a pretty girl, no doubt about it. There,
That's not Gary.
yeah, there
That's
she is.
Gary.
And
This is 16 years old, but right before her wedding.
she's a pretty girl, and Ed eventually ended up marrying her when she was about 18, and he was in his 20th year.
And then ultimately they moved to the Sykesville area, right? Now, why did they do that?
My daddy was a Rolling Stone. You've heard that. You've heard the song. My father was a Rolling Stone. My dad was a Rolling Stone, and he gallivanted a lot. After he married Carrie, they'd venture around. In fact, they'd ventured as far as Northern Virginia. My daddy found a job on a dairy farm, and they lived in the tenant house, which was a house up on pigs. Some of you have know well what that image would conjure up. And he worked on the farm, and Carrie, and she only had the one boy then, Clifton, the oldest boy. They would be there in the house during the day. And according to her, one day she heard this knocking on the door. Now the house was on pegs, and she went to the door, nobody's there. But the knocking didn't stop. So she went outside, looked around, looked under the house, nothing. And when Ed came home, she was telling him about it. And Ed didn't know whether or not that was completely accurate, but he decided that he would, after milking, he'd come back home and stick around and see what happened. And, almost with deliberation, a knocking on the door when Ed was there. And he went to the door, nobody's there. So he goes outside, looks around, nobody. Looks under the house, nobody. So what do you think he did then? In those, huh?
He moved away.
In those days, you could rent a team of horses in a wagon. Got him a team of horses in a wagon. You only had one kid then. Put them in the wagon. Put Carrie and Clifton in the wagon, and he took off. He was going to live someplace where he couldn't explain happenings like that. So he took off. But it was part of his nature anyway, because he was a Roman man. Had been from the time that his mother died.
So they ended up living with a sister on Obrecht Road, right?
Yeah, when they left Virginia, where these knockings had occurred, they were headed back, really back to Bush Park. But he didn't have any real ties there, except that's where he grew up. But he had a sister, Rose, who lived on a little farm, not very productive, not too far from here, off of Bulwark Road. And he ended up there. He only had he had one kid when he left Virginia, and on the way back, really his destination that he had in mind was back to Bush Park, but his sister Rose lived off of Obrick Road, and she had a place he thought perhaps he could hold up for a while. And so that's exactly what he did. And during about the same time, Springfield State Hospital, which this property here was a part of, was established as a facility to accommodate mental patients from the Caucasian race. And early on, African Americans were only employed as like groundkeepers and as handyman in the kitchen and all, but it was the only stable work that was available, so that Ed thought he might be able to get a job. So he did. And initially, he used to be the handy boy around the kitchen, have been to help prepare vegetables, wash pots and pans, and that kind of business. But the lady who was the dietitian who was in charge of the kitchen found out that my daddy Ed, he could do more than just wash pots and pans. He was proficient at preparing meals for large groups of people. And she found out that he could do a better job than some of the people they hired as cooks. So she gave him a chance. And he started out as a cook in Springfield, one of the units in this area in Springfield State Hospital. And the only stable job my father ever really had, maybe in his lifetime. I've told you he raised himself, he roamed a lot, and he worked for a while until he get to the point where he couldn't tolerate the kind of treatment African Americans used to have to take from those who supervised in those days. And he was not a violent man, and he would take it as long as he could before he'd quit. So he worked the longest stretch that I know of for about 10 years at this at one of the units here on these grounds as a cook.
Now, during that period, he acquired the house where you grew up.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
The man who owned the property where I grew up, name was Brown. He owned, and Brown owned quite a expanse of ground there, and but his skill and what he made his money at was carpentry. He was a carpenter here at Springfield, and so Ed and A.C. Brown paths crossed on, I guess, on many occasions. And Ed used to talk about some place of his own, and Brown wanted to sell the place he owned, which is on what is recognized even today as Oklahoma Hill. So Brown wanted to move down in the town proper and go in business. So he and Ed talked about it, and eventually they struck a deal. Brown told Ed, I can let you have the place, everything. The house, the buildings, the animals, they had farm animals, all of it for $3,200. That was back in 1920. A little over 45 acres of ground, and a house and the buildings that necessary to house animals, and to operate sort of a small farm. So they came to the deal, and Ed sought financing in the town of Sykesville. Nobody would lend him a penny. He had gotten enough because of his frugal ways. He had saved up a little over $1,000, and he needed to borrow the rest. But nobody in Sykesville would let him have anything. So A.C. Brown and my father ventured as far as Manchester. Some of you know where that is. And they found a bank that would make him a loan on the place for an interest-only loan. Some of you know what that is, don't you? I don't know, like maybe it's still available, I don't know.
It's like rent, not good. It's like rent, basically.
That's yes, it is.
It was only $40 a year, right?
$40 a year. So, and my daddy never paid it off. My mother finally did pay it off.
Okay, so they got the house.
Yes.
And very shortly thereafter, they had a child, and that was you, right?
In 1920, they moved there in June of 1920. In November of 1920, Warren Dorsey was born. But that in itself is quite a story.
Yes, let's hear the story.
Well, they lived in the house that they had was just a typical, what you recognize now, typical tenant house on a farm. And they lived there, and they only had available to them the services that were generally available to African Americans during the day. Well, when it come time for my mother to deliver me, they just moved to the place in June, and in November she was about to give birth, and Aunt Kitty, her mother, had come to supervise the event, since they had no services from any trained medical people.
There was no electricity, no water, no light?
No.
Okay.
And on a cold night in November 17th, 1920, my grandmother was in attendance, and I was born. And I was a frail child, and today I'd be in a neonatal unit if I was born under those circumstances, but there wasn't any such thing available then. And my grandmother handed me to my mother, and she said, "Pray over the little fellow. I don't think he'll last through the night." She was off just a mite. Just a mite.
So how'd you get your name?
In those days, most of the people who lived in communities were ex-slaves and other freed African Americans were illiterate. They hadn't had any schools. But for some, out of seemingly nowhere, a man appeared, and he had no belongings.
I'm sorry. This man appeared in Bushy Park, right?
Appeared in Bushy Park. He had no belongings, but he was literate. Nobody knows how that came about, but he provided a service for the community. He was their tie between their condition of living and the community at large that you had to do business with. He was literate, and he acted as their link to the outside world. And he used to go around visiting, and I wrote a little story about it. In fact, I think it's the first thing I showed Jack.
Was. Professor Lee, right?
Yes, people knew him only as Professor Lee. They never did know any other name. He never identified himself as anything else, and nobody ever called him anything else. He appeared in the community, and he was literate, and he would hang his hat wherever people would offer him a nice stay, and he did good among the people. And I wrote a little story, and I called him Black Jesus. Jesus went about doing all kinds of deeds among the poor and downtrodden. And Professor Lee did that. And he used to go around visiting. And he was visiting my parents the night I was, 2 weeks after I was born. And I had no name. And my suspicion is my mother never expected me to live, so there was no point in wasting names. She had a whole lot of kids. So Professor Lee, finding this out, asked my mother if he could name me. And she did. There was one of the America's most famous presidents elected that November. And I bet you all don't even remember who he was. Warren Harding. Warren Gamaliel Harding. And Professor Lee said, "Can I name him?" And Ken said, "Yeah, you can name him." And he gave me my name, Warren Gamaliel Harding. I've been called that ever since. Well, that's not the only thing I've been called. What I was called that.
Are you proud to bear the name of Warren Gamaliel Harding?
Yes.
They also called you Tom, right? Your dad gave you the name Tom.
In the early days, when I was still a toddler, I was 2 years old for a walk. I used to crawl around in the dirt because I was born prematurely. And well, my daddy used to recite a little-known nursery rhyme. It goes like this. Little Tommy Tittlemouse lived in a little house. He caught fishes in other men's ditches.
Now,
And he was, let me finish. So he started singing this little song, little rhyme, and people initially called me Tommy, and he got shortened to Tom, and I've been called Tom by the people in the neighborhood, and most of them who lived in the neighborhood where I grew up didn't know my name wasn't. Some of them assumed I'm named Thomas, but no. My daddy had sing this little ditty, Little Tom Tittlemouse, lived in a little house, he caught fishes in other men's ditches, and that's where all that came from.
so I was going to ask you, what happened to Professor Lee after he named you?
Professor Lee, sometime after he named me, disappeared as mysteriously as he'd appeared. Out of nowhere, nobody knows where he came from. He had no relatives, and he had no earthly belongings. And I could venture that after he got a good look at me, it frightened him and he left. But I don't know.
Let's move on to where did you go to school?
For many, many years, there was no schoolhouse available to African Americans in Sykesville until, and Pat Greenwald knows this story a whole lot better than I do. The people in the community started the noise about not having any means of education. See, all of the adults of the community were primarily functionally illiterates.
Now, this is on Oklahoma Road now.
On
This is not
Oklahoma
Bushy
Road.
Park. How many families were there?
There were 14 families. How do I know that? I just do. Can I still name all of them? Yes, I can. But all of them, the last one moved away. She was my sister-in-law. No, I still have a niece who lives there in that area. But basically, they're all gone away. And we started, the first opportunity we had to go to school was a schoolhouse at the bottom of a hill, on the bottom of the hill that we owned. And it was about to be dismantled, and because it was falling into ruin, until somebody, guy named Lewis, his name wasn't Lewis, Henderson.
Well, who sold the land?
No,
Oh, who went to the schoolhouse?
but he sold the land was sold by the third mayor of Sykesville, if I'm not mistaken. We called him Asa Hefner, and he owned. He sold a piece of land that the community had been agitating about not having any school, and he built a school there. It was activated, and Pat Greenwald, if I'm wrong, blame her. It was activated in 1904.
January 3rd, 1904.
Wasn't much for school. The lady that came to teach probably had no specific training for teaching, but that's where we started the school. That's where I got my start. I went to school there up until the 5th grade. I hadn't learned it a whole lot in that time, primarily because the lady who was the teacher didn't do a whole lot. She was hired out of Baltimore. She used to ride the train on the B&O, which is mostly a commercial line. But in those days, they ran 3 passenger trains a day each way. But that's how we got started. And I went there until I was in the 5th grade. Hadn't learned a whole lot. And the county decided that they were going to take the 5th, 6th, and 7th grades out of there and give them a better chance at education, a better school. At Johnsville. Johnsville is sort of northwest of Eldersburg. Some of you know where it is. It was a black enclave in those days. And the county said, now, you 5th, 6th, and 7th graders will no longer go to the little schoolhouse in Sykesville. You'll go to Johnsville. They left one important detail out of it. No way to get there. African Americans were never provided any transportation in the early days to get to the schools. It was up to your parents and other adults in the neighborhood and yourself to get to the school. And it never did solve it as satisfactory as they'd like to. We ended up walking most of the time. And it's a distance from Sykesville, where we lived, to Johnsville, where the school was, of just over 4 miles. And we started that when I was in the 5th grade. Well, by the time elementary school then was 7 grades. By the time I finished 7th grade, I thought that was the end of it, because there was no high school. But they did establish a high school in Westminster, which is in the sort of northern part of the county. But almost all of the potential students lived in the southern part of the county. But the county never provided any transportation. But a guy who taught in the county was willing to help out. And the guy who was made the principal of the first high school we ever had, which was a couple old Army-type barracks stacked and made into a 2-story building. And the building still stands. It's been, this has multiple use. It's been renovated, but it still stands.
What was it called?
What?
What was the school called?
Robert Moten High School.
Robert Moten High School.
The Robert Moten High School. Now, we thought it was out of the question that I had a sister who was in the same, because of happenstance, ended up in the same grade level I was. We were out of elementary school. We thought that was the end of it. But 2 young men from the community found out that the principal of this new high school had succeeded in getting an old rickety bus, and he used to travel the main highways to pick up kids and haul them into Westminster to the school that they built, Robert Moten High School. It was at first just one old building, a barracks-type building on top of the other, and they split down the middle with folding doors, and they could make it in 4 classrooms. But they assigned 2 teachers to teach 4 levels of high school, all subjects. But by surprise that was our first real stroke of luck. The 2 people that they picked to man this new school and teach everything was one Daisy Harris and George Crawford. I don't know if you've ever heard of them or not, but George Crawford went on to get his PhD. He ended up by in the State Board of Education in charge of curriculum development. Daisy Harris ended up teaching at Frederick High School. By anybody's standards, they were master teachers. And I say that with confidence because the only high school education I got, George Crawford and Daisy Harris were responsible. And I guess I could give them some credit for being partially successful. And I got a daughter sitting here, so a photograph that was taken the day that I finished Morgan College.
You skipped high school?
Well, we'll talk about high school.
Yeah, we're still talking about high school.
Well, in high school, I was not anything special, but on the night of a graduation, a lady from one of the civic organizations in the town, in Westminster, came to our graduation exercises, and she had an award for whoever finished first in the class. I found out that the person who finished first in the class was Warren Dorsey. I had no, because that was not emphasized when I was going to high school.
So you were the best student in your high school?
Yes.
And then you got the idea of going to college?
Well, what also came along with being first in the class, the state of Maryland gave a scholarship to a Maryland college of $50. $50 wouldn't even buy you a textbook these days, but it was quite a bit of money in those days. And although my family didn't know anything about a college or anything of that sort, but once that award was made, I started thinking that maybe you can go to college. What a earth-shaking idea for this little boy who lived there on Oklahoma Hill. But all the time before then, if any of us, the older ones in the family, of my siblings, ever got a job, a daytime job, and we often could get a day's work on a farm or something, the money wasn't yours. The money belonged to the family, so you turned it over to my mama. But when I got the idea that with his scholarship, there's a possibility I might maybe go to college, and my mother said, you can keep anything you make and save it toward trying to get into college. And I was working for a farmer off of Route 32 near West Friendship. And I'd been following a threshing machine up until that time. Some of you might know about that era. And if you're interested, I can tell you all about that too. But after the harvest, after the threshing was over, this farmer on this farm there hired me to stay on and work as a day laborer.
What were they paying you?
10 cents an hour. We worked 10 hours a day for $1. That doesn't sound like a whole lot of money today. But I guess that's what was the going rate in those days. And I was, after the harvest, during the harvest season when we were threshing grain, you get 15 cents an hour to aid with the harvesting. And but in the summer, the threshing was over, it was in August, and the last farm I worked on, threshing wheat mostly, wanted some day hands, and he hired me on to stay as a day laborer, 10 cents an hour. And I did a variety of things. Pitching hay was one of them. And when I got the idea that I might go to college after getting that scholarship, when my mother said, you can save whatever you make toward that end. And the old man who hired me had me out in the field getting in hay. We were pitching hay. Some of you might know what that's all about. Don't do that anymore. I don't think. So when I got the idea that with a little bit of scholarship and a little bit of money you were able to save, you might try to get into college. And when the old farmer came out to the field and we were getting in hay, and I got his attention, I said, "Sir, I'm going to be leaving at the end of the week. I didn't want to know what you're going to leave, boy, what you're leaving for." I told him I'm going to try to get into college. What you going to college for? You don't need any college to pitch hay. So that's all you're ever going to do is pitch hay. And he's probably right. You don't need a college education to pitch hay. At least it didn't the way we used to pitch it. But I said, well, maybe one day I might be able to teach. That was one of the almost non-existent professional kinds of job that a African American could get who had finished college. And the boy and the farm looked at me just like I'm looking at that young lady who was with the media center, I guess. And he looked at me and said, "Boy, you know a nigger ain't got sense enough to teach." And from his point of view, I guess he was convinced of that. In retrospect, he probably wasn't able to do much. He probably didn't have sense enough to do much more than what he was doing either. But that's a whole other story.
Tell us about the day you left for college.
Well, the day I left for college, I told you about my father. My father had a brilliant mind, never an opportunity to use his hidden talents. But he used to have these attacks. He said there were asthma attacks, and there might have been, I don't know. But they seemed to come at convenient times, whenever he wanted to control the situation. And mostly control my mother, because if she had opportunity to maybe go visit one of the relatives, one of the boys who got in a car, we're going to take her, he'd get in one of these almost death-defying fits to keep her from going. And the day that I had picked to leave home to try to get into college, I went to the bedroom where he was. My mother was sitting with him. He was sitting on the side of the bed, heaving and coughing as if every breath would be his last one. And there was only one male left when I left, and there was still work to do around the farm in order to raise the vegetables we used for food and to take care of the animals, the farm animals. And I started thinking, well, maybe I can go on my venture later on, and maybe I have to sacrifice my opportunities for the good of the family. And my father was there, and my mother was sort of trying to ease his pain a bit, and he was heaving and coughing as if every breath would be his last. And I think that what was happening, he was using this as a controlling device to keep me from going, to keep me working on that little farm we had. But my mother said, I've been nicknamed Tom, which I told you about that. She told me, she said, "Tom, you go on." I left home. I had a bag, sort of a card kind of a little suitcase with everything I owned, clothes, maybe a change of clothes. And my mother said, "You go on." So I took off from where we lived on Oklahoma Hill to walk down the road to the main street, and a guy who was in business with Marion Harris, some of you might have heard of him, the Harris department store, operated by Marion Harris and his sister Margaret, and Henry Forsyth, who once had a store of his own, but it burned, and he had bought interest in the Harris store, and he used to go to the wholesale markets to pick up stuff to sell in the store, and I knew that. And so I had approached him about giving me a ride to Baltimore. And he said, yes, if you're down here when I get ready to go, it'll be around 5 o'clock in the morning, I'll take you to Baltimore. So the day I left home, with my little bag, but one change of clothes, and I walked down the road to Sykesville, got a ride with Henry Forsyth. He took me to Baltimore and let me out on Pratt Street and Fulton Avenue. Some of you might know, if you know much about Baltimore, you might have somebody right his way downtown. And I walked uptown with my little bag. I had a sister who lived in Baltimore, and she was teaching. That's a whole interesting story too. She taught in the Baltimore school system, and she lived near North Avenue on Pressman Street. I walked up there. It's at least 2 miles, and I knocked on her door, and she came to the door, and I told you I was nicknamed Tom, and she says, "Tom, I know why you're here. You're going to try to get into college." And she told me, my husband and I are not, they bought that little house, and he wasn't getting full week's work anymore. He worked for Sparrows Point and Bethlehem Steel, and rather than lay its workers off, they give him sometimes 2 days a week, 1 day a week, and he wasn't making much. And he was taking everything they could scrape together to keep this little house. But she said, if you're going to try to get into college, I can guarantee you'll have something to eat and a place to stay if you can manage the rest. And that's how I got started on my journey.
So what time are we at here?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock? Wow. You have a sister here. Rosie.
Oh, Rosie, yeah. And I have a nephew, Martin. I've got a daughter.
Rosie, do you want to give a speech or sing a song or tell us
No,
to?
indeed. That's my brother's world.
Is that Paula Kay back there? Yeah, she's my.
Live a different way.
She is my niece from Baltimore. My sister Rosie, she's the only 2 of us left. I won't tell you how old she is, but
Hey, I'm proud. I'm 95 years old.
she's 95. And then made it up here.
She snuck in, man. She was afraid I'd draw attention to it. So I think we can't just tell the whole story. Want to sing some songs? Or is there anything else?
I was going to start with this.
Yeah.
We can all, and those who know it can sing along. Or I'm just going to do the one
Did you hand
verse.
out some of the...
Yeah, I thought we could have you sing the first verse, and then if we sing the first verse again, we could all join in.
Okay.
So, guys, you're good? Sure. Lift every voice and sing. Can somebody help me pass these out, Ken?
Yeah, sing along.
Count. Count how many people.
I know that there's some melodious voices out there, so but my sister has this remark, said, don't say sing a song around Tom. Said all you say is sing, he's up and going.
Could still call you Poppy?
What?
We can
Yeah.
still call you Poppy?
My daughter.
She's over there. Susan.
Yeah, Susan, she's over
She
there.
calls him Poppy.
But she's the only one. I've
She texts
had
me.
3 kids.
How's Poppy
2 boys
getting
and a
there?
girl. Okay, I'll sing it through and then we all join in. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as a rolling sea. There's a verse, there's a refrain that's not here. But let's just sing this together. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoices rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound far as the rolling sea. In other words,